Welcome to Grosse Pointe Congregational Church for our Sunday worship. We're glad to have you with us. Enjoy our sermon this morning. Following the message, you'll find a link to give to our church, as well as a web link so you can visit our church website for upcoming future church events. Many of our events are done over Zoom. We hope that you'll be able to attend any or all of our scheduled activities. God's blessings be with you. Enjoy our message from Sunday morning.
A modest 60-year-old pastor who believed that God's mercy is mighty enough to cover every conceivable sin was interviewed by the New York Times in 2007 to discuss why he granted God's blessings upon the devil after he baptized a serial killer in prison. After the baptism, the small Wisconsin church fired Reverend Roy Ratcliffe and ordered him and his family to leave their town. Screaming obscenities as the family drove past the church for their final time, church members expressed their anger, shouting that if heaven welcomes serial killers, they want no part of it. When he attended a clergy conference, there were some who pointed their fingers, saying that he should be ashamed for sharing salvation with a murderer. One minister even went so far to declare that if God was that merciful, then that is not the God the church should be serving. Yet, as Pastor Ratcliffe said in the interview, is it possible that an evil person can turn to God? I have to believe that, he says. But what part of Christ can't save that sinner, but can save you? Pastor Ratcliffe raises an important question for us to consider. Is anyone beyond the reach of God's grace to be rescued from their past selves, our past guilt, or even the past identity? As we consider these questions, it's important to recall that repeatedly in Jesus' ministry, he was liberating people from their sinfulness. People like the woman caught in adultery, the thieving tax collector, the Roman centurion, and so forth. Jesus also utilized multiple parables to reveal how grand and how marvelous God's grace extended, like the parables of the prodigal son, who even went so far to curse his father and wish him dead so he could have half his inheritance. The parable of the woman who lost a coin, so she turns her house literally upside down, ready to burn it down, just so she can find one lost coin. And the parable of the shepherd, who leaves 99 sheep behind just to go seeking one lost sheep, which, as some storytellers have unpacked the story, they suggest that the lone sheep was possibly found on the edge of a cliff where it needed rescuing. Jesus believed every person both needed grace and deserved mercy, even those who viewed themselves as unholy. Jesus used sermon illustrations of lost sons and lost sheep, primarily because that's what the people of his time had personal knowledge about. Perhaps if Jesus spoke to our modern times to illustrate the uniqueness of people, he might use the example of lost apples. Apples, you may ask? Why apples? Well, according to the modern farmer, there used to be over 17,000 known varieties of apples in the United States. Today, there are just 5,000. So where did these 12,000 apples and varieties go? This question was posed by former FBI agent and IRS investigator Dave Penscotter. Attempting to answer this question turned out to be more difficult than he initially thought. Thus, out of his pursuit to answer this question was born the Lost Apple Project. Dave claims there was no easy answer, but some reasons he discovered is that some were bitter or sour, while others were simply too difficult to grow, and commercial growers weren't interested in the time and energy required. Yet he says these apples have value and they have a need, because as you rescue these apples, you can find genetic codes which can bring some of the apples back that we've lost. In addition, preserving genetic material is important because it can be used to breed new types of apples, which can grow better in various climates and conditions, which is important as we see global weather patterns constantly change. And just as these apples are unique and worth saving, so is every person. Every person is worth preserving like apples for the good of all. The heart of Jesus' message that he preached throughout Galilee was that the Spirit of God was upon him so he could bring good news to the poor, release to those held captive and to sin, and to bring recovery of sight to the blind. Sticking with the apple metaphor here, Jesus essentially held up a red delicious for them to enjoy. However, the people in his hometown saw nothing more than a sour green apple. To them, it was unattractive and bitter, as they believed God was not in the business of saving. Rather, God was in the business of rewarding those who followed God's directions daily from birth. In other words, imperfections were not permitted, and only specific types of sinners, by their standards, were acceptable. In a way, Jesus embarked on his own lost apple project when he began to rebuke the people, declaring, "The truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon." The people in Nazareth were familiar with this story, and they were starting to grow agitated that Jesus even mentioned it as a sermon illustration. They recognized that the prophet Elijah had angered the king and queen of Israel by condemning King Ahab's actions. Elijah further added to the king's fury when he declared that there would be a severe drought throughout Israel. Fleeing the king's wrath, God sent the prophet to a foreign land to live with a widow and her son. While there, he raised the widow's son from death, and he blessed their wells so that they never ran out of water, while everyone else back in Israel suffered. Following this account, Jesus recounted the story of the many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them were cleansed except Naaman, the Syrian. That did it. Jesus had gone too far. He described the healing of a Gentile army commander, a foreigner who had been healed by God's power, even while God's people suffered. The last example upset the apple basket, and the people were filled with rage. They began to drive Jesus toward the cliffs that they could hurl him down. Yet as they neared the edge, Luke doesn't say what changed, but Jesus was able to walk through their midst and go on his way. As Jesus entered the next town, he returned to the mission of his ministry, and he healed a man with an unclean spirit. He healed Simon's mother-in-law, and he kept preaching in the synagogues around Galilee. Jesus ministered to the people as he refused to let the actions of those in Nazareth change his view that every person was unique and valuable. Jesus believed every person was worth preserving for the good of all, and he recognized this view was central to his ministry. When we turn to the chapter 19 of Luke, we witness Jesus' incredible expression of mercy when he met Zacchaeus up in a tree. Zacchaeus, by the way, was hated by his fellow townspeople because he chose to collect taxes for the enemy, the foreign Roman Empire. Zacchaeus was also given authority by Rome to imprison anyone who didn't pay their taxes, which included work camps and hard labor. And trust me, Zacchaeus most likely did that. You only get power if you're willing to exercise it. So after Jesus discovered Zacchaeus in the tree, Jesus recognized that Zacchaeus was valuable and needed preserved. Jesus invited himself to Zacchaeus' home, and recognizing that Jesus wasn't condemning him, Zacchaeus repented on the spot and promised to repay everyone back 4 times what he had taken from them. After this, Luke says Zacchaeus proclaimed that salvation had come upon him and that Jesus, the Son of Man, had come to seek and save the lost. Based on this, Jesus' ministry is about seeing the unique special qualities in every person, and that he came to seek and save the lost. And so then it's our role as his disciples to do the same, to see every person as valuable and worth preserving for the good of all, to seek the lost and save the lost, to share God's mercy with all we meet, recognizing that there are some bad apples in the bunch, but it doesn't mean they are beyond saving or offering grace to. And this includes even ourselves. Wonderfully, Jesus' ministry says no one is beyond his reach and beyond God's tender mercy. And it's his desire that we all gather as a bushel of people doing the same. So instead of being upset about who Jesus is admitting or who repents and who is baptized, the gospel of Jesus is an invitation for all of us to join with him in this beloved community. He desires that we adopt his open heart stance to become his hands of love. So when we look around us, we see persons who have been deemed sinful, unwanted, or broken, and then filled with God's mercy. We offer ourselves to them so that they can discover Christ. Through us, they can discover God's grace. Through us, they can receive God's mercy and unconditional love. Thus, they can be healed, forgiven, and redeemed. Through our mutual love, they can rejoin society and find partners who can reveal the power of God. And just as wonderfully as they can find God through us, perhaps through them, we can find God as well. And we can see God's activity in surprising places, sometimes in church, sometimes in prison, sometimes in places we weren't expecting God to arrive. Through Christ, he helps us to create a community of care so we all experience his peace, recalling that he came for us and he came to seek and save the lost. We are all part of Jesus' Lost Apple Project, and he has come to preserve everyone for the good of all.